She came to survive. She stayed to fight. And everything she saved was never supposed to be hers. There's a moment right before a person decides to stop running when the ground beneath them feels like it could give way at any second. Elena Hartwell knew that feeling well. She'd felt it when she buried her husband. She'd felt it on the stage road heading west with nothing but a worn carpet bag and a name on a piece of paper. And she felt it now, standing at the edge of a dying vineyard in the Arizona heat, looking at rows of twisted, brittle vines that hadn't seen a careful hand in years, realizing the man who'd hired her was barely holding himself together, and the land he'd promised her was already half a grave. She should have turned around. She didn't. If you've ever had to choose between what's safe and what's right, stay with me. Drop the name of your city in the comments, and let's see how far this story travels. Hit like, and let's begin. The stage from Tucson to Harlan Creek ran twice a week, and on a Wednesday in late October of 1883, it carried 6 passengers, 3 mail bags, a crate of machine parts, and one woman who had absolutely no idea what she was walking into. Elena Hartwell sat wedged against the far window, her carpet bag between her boots, watching the desert scroll past in shades of rust and bone. The man beside her, a portly cattle buyer from Flagstaff, had fallen asleep 20 minutes outside of Tucson and hadn't stopped snoring since. Across from her, a young couple traveling to their new homestead held hands without speaking, the way people do when they're frightened but don't want the other one to know. Elena understood that silence well. She was 31 years old. She had $11.40 in her coat pocket, a wedding ring she hadn't taken off because removing it felt like admitting something she wasn't ready to admit, and a folded newspaper advertisement that she'd read so many times the crease had gone soft. Wanted. Capable woman, experienced in general household management and outdoor work to assist in operation of working vineyard. Room, board, and fair wages provided. Inquire. S. Mercer, Mercer Estate, Harlan Creek, Arizona Territory. She'd answered it on a Tuesday. By Thursday, she'd had a letter back. Short, utilitarian, written in a cramped hand that suggested a man who didn't waste words. By the following Monday, she was on a stage going west. Her sister-in-law back in New Mexico had called her reckless. Her neighbor, Mrs. Flores, had pressed a rosary into her hand and said a prayer under her breath. Elena had thanked her, packed her bag, and left before she could talk herself out of it. The truth was simpler than reckless. She had nothing left in Socorro. The house had gone to settle Thomas's debts. Debts she hadn't known about until the lawyer showed up with paperwork and a face full of practiced sympathy. The shop Thomas had owned, the tools, the wagon, all of it absorbed back into the machinery of obligation before the dirt on his grave had finished settling. She'd been left with the carpet bag, the $11, and the kind of quiet that presses down on a person like a physical weight. The advertisement had offered work. That was enough. The stage lurched over a bad rut in the road, and the cattle buyer woke with a grunt, looked around wildly, then settled back against his seat with a grunt of an entirely different register. The young couple across the aisle shifted. Outside, the desert stretched out flat and enormous, interrupted only by clusters of saguaro standing like sentinels in the afternoon heat. Elena pressed her forehead briefly against the glass and made herself breathe. "You've done harder things," she told herself, though at that particular moment she was having some difficulty remembering what they were. The town of Harlan Creek announced itself with a water tower and a smell of dust and livestock, in that order. It wasn't much. A main street of perhaps 24 buildings, most of them practical, a few of them ambitious. A general mercantile. A feed store. A livery with a sagging roof that someone had propped up with a timber angled at a worrying degree. A saloon that had been painted red at some point, the color now faded to something closer to the memory of red. A church with a bell tower but no bell visible in it. A small hotel with a sign that read rooms, clean and reasonable. The word reasonable having done a lot of heavy lifting in that particular promise. The stage rattled to a stop in front of the mercantile, and the driver climbed down to begin unloading the mail and cargo. Elena stepped out onto the wooden sidewalk, stretched her back carefully, and looked around for someone who might be Silas Mercer. She didn't see anyone waiting. She stood there for a few minutes with her carpet bag, watching the town move around her. A woman hanging laundry over a fence, a boy chasing a dog through an alley, 2 older men seated in chairs outside the feed store, having what appeared to be a conversation consisting entirely of long silences. "You the woman answering the Mercer advertisement?" She turned. The speaker was a woman in her mid-50s, heavy-set, with iron gray hair pinned under a practical bonnet and the kind of face that had made a decision about the world a long time ago and hadn't revisited it since. She was standing in the doorway of the mercantile, arms crossed. "I am," Elena said. "Elena Hartwell." The woman looked at her the way one might evaluate a horse, openly, without embarrassment, from feet to face and back again. "Martha Gillum," she said. "I keep this store. Mercer was supposed to come in today for supplies. He sent a boy instead with a note." She held it out. Elena took it. Same cramped handwriting as the letter. "Mrs. Hartwell. Apologies." Held up by fence work on the south pasture. Follow the road west out of town 2 miles. Turn left at the Red Rock Formation, another 1.5 miles. You'll see the property. S. Mercer. Elena read it twice. He sent directions. He did. To walk 2 miles in the... She stopped herself. Started again. "Is there a horse I can hire? Or a cart?" Martha Gillum's expression shifted by approximately 1 degree. Not quite sympathy, not quite amusement, somewhere between the two. "I can lend you a mule. She's old, but she'll get you there." She paused. "You should know something before you go." "All right. Half this town has taken a bet on how long you'll last. Most of them said a week. Few generous souls said 2. Elena held her gaze. "And you? Did you take a bet?" Martha Gillum's mouth made a small motion that wasn't quite a smile, but was adjacent to one. "I never bet on things that are settled before they start." She pushed off the doorframe. "Come around back. I'll get you the mule." The Red Rock Formation was exactly where the note said it would be. A cluster of sandstone formations the color of dried blood, stacked against the skyline like something left behind by an indifferent giant. Elena turned left, and the mule, whose name Martha had told her was Agnes, and who had opinions about her pace that she expressed freely, picked her way along a rutted track between scrub brush and scattered juniper. The vineyard appeared in sections. First she saw the fence line, wooden posts with sagging wire, some of the posts leaning at angles that suggested they'd given up on the vertical some time ago. Then, as the track curved around a low rise, the vines. They stretched across perhaps 40 acres of flattish ground between 2 low ridges, arranged in rows that had been orderly once and were now something else. Many of the plants were clearly dead, their canes dry and gray as driftwood, offering nothing to the air but shadow. Others were alive in a technical sense. There was still green somewhere in them, but they were overgrown in ways that told a story about years of missed pruning and neglect. The trellis wires had given way in multiple places, vines sagging to the ground where the support had failed. Some rows were missing plants entirely, gaps like missing teeth in an uneven mouth. Elena stopped Agnes at the crest of the rise and sat looking at it for a long moment. Dying was her first thought. Her second thought came slower, and it surprised her. But not dead. There was a difference. She'd learned that on her father's farm in Kansas as a girl, the difference between a sick animal and a dead one, between a field that had failed and a field that had been failed. These vines hadn't given up. They'd been abandoned. Those weren't the same thing. She set that observation aside carefully, like something she might need later. The house sat at the far end of a gravel path, a 2-story adobe structure that had been built with some ambition once. The walls were solid, the roof appeared intact, and someone had planted roses along the front in the not-too-distant past, though they were badly in need of attention. A barn stood to the east, and beyond it, she could see a small outbuilding and what looked like a stone structure that might have been a root cellar or a fermentation room. A man was walking toward her from the direction of the barn. He was not what she'd expected. She wasn't sure exactly what she'd expected. The advertisement had given her nothing but a name and a need. But she'd built some version of him in her imagination on the long stage ride, the way you do when you're traveling toward an unknown. Something older, perhaps. More worn down. The word desperate had been in the advertisement, between the lines, if not in them, and desperation had a look she'd learned to recognize. Silas Mercer was perhaps 37 or 38, tall enough that he had to duck through the barn door she could see behind him, with broad shoulders that suggested a man who'd done real physical work for most of his life. His face was tanned to the color of old wood, angular in a way that might have been considered handsome in a hard light, with a dark beard going a little ragged and eyes that she couldn't make out the color of from a distance, but that were watching her with the careful attention of a man who was measuring something. He stopped a few feet from Agnes and looked up at her. "Mrs. Hartwell." "Mr. Mercer." She climbed down from the mule without waiting for assistance, which she could see registered somewhere behind his eyes. "You sent directions." "I did. I'm sorry I wasn't in town to—" "It's fine. Agnes and I managed." He glanced at the mule. "You know her name." "Martha Gillum told me." Something in his expression tightened briefly at the mention of the mercantile owner's name. "Right, Martha." He reached out and took Agnes's reins with the automatic ease of someone who'd handled animals his whole life. "I'll put her up and show you around. You've had a long ride." "I have." She followed him toward the barn. "Mr. Mercer, I'd like to see the vineyard before it gets dark." He paused mid-stride, turned slightly. "You just got here." "I know. But I've been looking at it for the last 10 minutes, and I'd like a closer look before we have whatever conversation we're going to have about wages and quarters." He studied her for a moment. The afternoon light was starting to angle, going gold and thin. "All right," he said finally. "Let me water the mule first." He walked her through the rows himself, and she watched him as much as she watched the vines. He moved through his own vineyard like a man walking through a room where something bad had happened. Careful, contained, with a kind of deliberate blankness over his face that she recognized as the expression people wear when they're keeping themselves from feeling something in real time. He answered her questions directly and without elaboration. "When was the last full pruning?" 2 years ago, maybe closer to 3. "And the trellis wire, when did that start going?" "Last winter, couldn't get to it." "The dead sections, are those from disease or drought?" A pause. "Both. Mostly drought. We had a bad dry stretch 2 summers ago. I lost—" He stopped. "I lost focus on the irrigation for a while." She let that sit without pulling at it. The soil was interesting. She crouched at the end of one row and worked her fingers into the earth, feeling the texture of it. Arizona wasn't wine country in any way the eastern markets would recognize, but the elevation here was higher than it looked, high enough for real temperature variation, warm days and cold nights, which was what vines actually wanted. Her father had kept a small orchard, and she'd spent enough seasons with her hands in soil to know good ground from bad. This wasn't bad ground. It was dry and neglected, but underneath the top crust, she could feel the composition of it. Rocky, mineral-rich, the kind of dirt that frustrated plants with shallow ambitions and rewarded ones willing to dig. "How many acres are still producing?" she asked. "Producing." The word came out with a faint, humorless quality. "Maybe 18, on a good year." "And the others?" "Salvageable, some of them. The rest—" He gestured at the gray rows, the dead canes rattling faintly in the evening breeze. "I don't know." She stood up, brushing soil from her palms. The sun was getting low, throwing long shadows across the rows, and in the low light the vineyard looked almost romantic. The tangle of it, the way the old wood curled and reached. She knew better than to trust that. Romance and a dying vineyard were 2 different things. "What did it look like?" she asked. "Before." He was quiet for a moment, a long moment in which the breeze moved through the vineyard and the shadows stretched further. "It was something," he said finally, quietly. "Margaret, my wife, she could look at a row of vines and tell you what they needed just by looking, like she spoke the language of them." Another pause, shorter this time. "She put this whole place together. Took 8 years. It was starting to be something real." "When did she pass?" 4 years ago? 4 years. And this was what 4 years of grief looked like when it was aimed inward. 40 acres of neglect and 18 acres barely hanging on, and a man who walked through his own land like he was apologizing to it. Elena looked at the dead rows, then at the living ones. "Mr. Mercer," she said, "I want to be straightforward with you. Please. When I answered your advertisement, I expected chickens, probably. A kitchen garden. Reasonable domestic work." He said nothing. "What you have here is—" She searched for the word. "Considerable." "I can pay what I advertised," he said, with a guardedness that told her he'd been waiting for this conversation to head somewhere difficult. "That's not what I mean." She turned to look at him directly. He was watching her with that careful expression, the one that didn't give much away. "I mean, I've been looking at this vineyard for 20 minutes and I think it can be saved. I also think no one has told you that in a while, or if they have, they didn't mean it. Something moved in his face, just briefly. A lot of people have told me to cut my losses, he said. I know. Martha Gilliam told me something to that effect before I was off the stage. And? Elena looked back at the vineyard, at the dead canes and the sagging wire and the gaps in the rows and the soil she'd felt, the living soil underneath the ruin. And I'd like to stay, she said. Not for a week. Not to see how it goes. I want to stay through at least one growing season and make a real attempt. That means I need to know everything. Finances, what's owed, what contracts you still have, everything. She looked at him again. Can you do that? He was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it probably was. You're not what I thought you'd be, he said. What did you think I'd be? I don't know. Someone more... He seemed to search for the word and give up on it. Someone who'd take the room and the wages and not ask so many questions. Do you want someone who won't ask questions? He looked at the vineyard, at the rows he'd walked through for 4 years, watching his wife's work come slowly undone. No, he said, I really don't. The kitchen was the best room in the house, large, practical, with a wood stove that had been recently used and a table scarred by years of work. He put water on for coffee and pulled a ledger from the shelf by the window with the mechanical motion of someone retrieving something they'd been avoiding. He set it on the table. She opened it. She was not an accountant, but she'd managed the household finances after Thomas died while simultaneously trying to understand why they were catastrophic, which had given her a practical education in reading numbers that told bad stories. The ledger told a bad story. There was debt. Not catastrophic, but serious, accumulated in slow increments over 4 years of reduced income and ongoing expenses. Property taxes 3 years running, paid barely on time, and in one case, not quite. A loan from a Tucson bank, modest in its origin, and now somewhat less modest with interest. Outstanding balances with several suppliers that had the look of accounts handled with increasing optimism. She didn't say anything for a while, just turned pages. Silas sat across the table with his coffee and didn't volunteer anything. How much time do you have? She finally asked. Realistically, before the bank becomes a real problem. Depends on the next harvest. How dependent? Very. He wrapped both hands around his mug. If the next harvest is strong, the contracts I still have with the buyer in Phoenix are enough to cover the banknote and leave something. If it's weak, he didn't finish that sentence. What's it been? The last 2 harvests have been acceptable. Not enough. We've been shrinking every year. He looked at the ledger. What you see in the rows is what the numbers look like. She closed the ledger, set her hands flat on it. The dead sections, she said. You know they're a liability even if they were producing, right? Old vines from the original planting, stressed from years of drought, fighting for resources with the healthy ones. I know. Taking them out and replanting with something better would take years, he said, to get to producing. I know that too. But the long term, Mrs. Hartwell. His voice wasn't unkind, but it had a weight in it. I know the arguments for long-term investment. I made those arguments myself once. What I don't have is the margin for long-term right now. What I need is a harvest in the spring that keeps this place from going to the bank. She was quiet. You said you wanted to stay, he said. And I appreciate that, genuinely. But I want you to understand what you're staying for. This isn't a story that's going well. I know what a story that isn't going well looks like, she said. I came from one. He looked at her. Not with pity, she was relieved to see she'd had enough of pity to last her, but with a kind of recognition. The room off the kitchen, he said. It was the housekeeper's room. It's modest, but it's clean, and you'd have privacy. He paused. It has a window that looks out toward the east rows. Is that meant to be a selling point? For the first time, something shifted in his expression into something almost dry. I thought you'd want to keep an eye on them. She surprised herself by almost smiling. Show me where I'm sleeping, she said, and tomorrow I want to start at first light. The room was what he'd said, modest, clean, with a narrow bed and a washstand and the window he'd mentioned. She could see the east rose from it, dark now under a sky crowded with stars, the desert night outside the glass so clear it was almost painful. She unpacked her carpet bag with her usual efficiency. 3 changes of clothes, a practical arrangement of her small necessities, her sewing kit, the photograph of Thomas she'd kept without entirely deciding to keep it, and the small journal she'd bought in Tucson with money she probably shouldn't have spent. She sat on the edge of the bed and looked at the photograph. Thomas Hartwell had been a pleasant man, not a complicated one. She'd married him at 23, believing that pleasantness and steadiness were the same thing, and had learned over 8 years of marriage that they were in fact quite different. He hadn't been unkind. He'd been incapable of saying, "This is more than I know how to manage." And so he hadn't managed it, and so she was here. She didn't hate him for it. She'd tried briefly, after the lawyer, and found she didn't have the energy for it. She tucked the photograph into the back of the journal. Outside, she could hear Silas Mercer moving around in the room above, the creak of floorboards, the sound of a drawer being pulled open. A man who lived alone in a house that had been built for more than one person. A man who walked through his own vineyard apologizing to it. She wasn't here to fix him. She needed to be clear about that, even if only to herself, in this small room in the first night of this new and uncertain life. She was here for the work. She was here because the land had potential, and she was capable of effort, and those two facts lined up in a way that made sense. She was not here to be anyone's salvage project, and she was not here to make anyone else hers. She turned off the lamp. The vineyard was dark outside the window, silent except for the wind through the dead canes, a dry rattling sound like something trying to speak in a language she hadn't learned yet. She closed her eyes. She was up before the light. That was habit. Her father's farm had taught her that the hour before dawn was the most useful one, cool and quiet, before the day made its demands. She dressed quickly, pulled on her work boots, and went to the kitchen to start the stove. She'd noticed where things were the night before. Coffee was where it should be, in a tin near the stove. The water bucket was full, which meant he'd drawn water the evening before, which meant he had some habits of maintenance even if the vineyard had suffered. She noted that. She had the coffee made and the stove going well by the time she heard his boots on the stairs. He appeared in the kitchen doorway and stopped when he saw her. She was already at the table with her own cup and the small notebook she'd started filling the night before with observations. "You're up," he said. "I said first light." "It's not—" He looked toward the window. Outside, the sky was going from black to dark blue. "It's barely light." "This is barely light," she agreed. "Do you want coffee?" He looked at the pot, then at her, then at the pot again. "All right," he said. He sat across from her with his cup and looked at what she was writing. "What is that?" "Observations from yesterday, the east rows. I want to get the full count today. How many plants are truly dead versus struggling? There's a difference." She looked up. "Do you have a pruning saw?" "Several." "Can I use them?" Something tightened briefly in his expression. Not quite objection, more like instinct resisting something. "What are you going to do?" "Evaluate. Nothing gets cut without you agreeing to it." She paused. "This is still your vineyard, Mr. Mercer." He held her gaze for a moment. The kitchen was warming from the stove, the light outside going slowly from blue to gray. "I know it is," he said quietly. It came out with a weight that suggested he was sometimes the only one who did. "Then let's go see what we have," she said. She worked the east rows first, methodically, with one of his pruning saws in hand and a stick of chalk to mark plants. The work of evaluation was simple in principle and tedious in practice. You moved through each plant, assessed the canes for life, checked the wood for disease, felt the soil at the base for moisture and condition. You made notes. You marked the ones that were worth saving and the ones that were done. Silas worked the row beside her at first, then gradually pulled ahead, doing his own assessment in a different style. Less systematic, more intuitive. The kind of evaluation that came from years of knowing a particular plant. She watched him when she could, noting how he handled the vines. There was something careful about it, gentle even, in a way that felt out of proportion to the guardedness he showed with everything else. Around mid-morning, she found the first good surprise. It was in the middle of the east section, in a cluster of plants she'd written off at first glance. Old, gnarled, the canes heavily overgrown with several years of unpruned growth piled on top of each other. She almost marked them all for removal. But she noticed that one of the plants, buried under the mess of dead canes on top, had new growth coming from the base. Clean, vigorous growth, the kind that came from a deep root system that had refused to give up. She crouched beside it and carefully cleared away the dead wood. "Mr. Mercer." He turned, was 3 rows over, came toward her. "Look at this," she said. He crouched beside her, and she watched his face as he saw what she was seeing, the live growth from the base of a plant that had looked dead from 2 feet away. "That's—" He stopped, leaned in closer. His hand went to the cane with an automatic tenderness that he probably wasn't aware of. "That's Grenache. This whole section is Grenache. It came from cuttings Margaret brought from a grower in California." He turned the cane carefully in his fingers. "I thought this whole section was gone." "It's not. Not all of it." She stood up, looked down the row. "The top growth is dead, a lot of it. But the root systems, they're deeper than they look. This soil—" She pressed her foot into the earth. "This soil holds more than it shows. They've been surviving on less than they needed, but they've been surviving." He was still crouching over the plant, very still. "How many?" he asked. "I don't know yet. That's what today is for." He looked up at her. The light had shifted to full morning, clear and sharp the way desert light got around 10 o'clock, without mercy or atmosphere. "Mrs. Hartwell," he said. "Elena." A pause. "Elena." He said it like he was trying it out. "Where did you learn this?" "My father kept an orchard in Kansas, and I read." She looked at the dead rows and the hiding alive ones, and the soil that kept more than it showed. "And I pay attention." He stood up, looked down the row, looked back at the plant with the live growth, the one that had been buried under its own ruin. "All right," he said. It wasn't a big statement. It was quiet, but something had shifted in it. "Let's find out how many are still in there." On the 3rd day, she went into town for supplies. She'd made a list the evening before. Specific things she needed for the initial soil treatment, some equipment for the trellis repair, a few practical items for the kitchen. She borrowed Agnes from Martha Gillum and drove into town in Silas's wagon, which rattled significantly but held together. She stopped at the mercantile first. Martha was behind the counter, glasses on, going through an invoice ledger, and she looked up when Elena came in without any particular expression. "Mrs. Hartwell, you're still here." "It's been 3 days." "Some have left in fewer." Martha set down her pen. "What do you need?" Elena handed over the list. Martha read it, eyebrows rising slightly at a few items. "Sulfur dust and lime," she said. "For the soil?" "Root health," Elena said. "The vines that are still viable need the soil amended around the base. It'll help with the drainage issues on the east slope." Martha gave her a long look over her glasses. "You know what you're doing with this, or are you guessing?" "I'm educated guessing," Elena said honestly, with a bias toward the evidence. A sound from the back of the store made her look up. 2 men were seated near the potbelly stove in the far corner. Not unusual for a mercantile, she'd learned. They functioned as social centers in small towns. One was thin and older, with a cattleman's look, dry and deliberate. The other was younger, with a satisfied fullness to his face that suggested a man accustomed to being right. The younger one was looking at her with the frank assessment of a person who didn't bother to conceal it. "You're the woman Mercer hired," he said. Not unfriendly exactly. More like the statement was the precursor to something else. "I am." She didn't stop looking at Martha's shelves. "How long you been at the estate?" 3 days. "And you're already buying soil amendments." He leaned back in his chair. "Ambitious." "Productive," she said. "Cecil Pratt," he said like she'd asked. "I own the Pratt Brothers Feed and Supply on the east end of Main Street." "Elena Hartwell." "You know that place is gone, right?" he said. Not cruelly, with the particular confidence of a man stating an obvious fact for someone's benefit. "I don't mean to be unkind about it, but Mercer's had 4 years to turn that vineyard around and he hasn't managed it. Bringing in a—" He paused briefly, making a choice. "Bringing in a housekeeper isn't going to fix what's fundamentally wrong with it." The thin older man by the stove shifted slightly. Martha continued reading her invoice with an attention to it that was a little too studied. Elena turned to look at Cecil Pratt directly. "What's fundamentally wrong with it?" she asked, with genuine curiosity in her voice. He seemed momentarily caught by that. He'd expected something else. Defense, perhaps? Or offense? "Well," he said, "it's years of neglect, poor management, and that soil, The soil is excellent, she said. Deep mineral content, good base drainage. If you correct the compaction on the east slope, the elevation gives you temperature variation that very few Arizona properties have. The vines that are still alive have root systems 4 feet down in places. The reason it looks done is that it's been mismanaged, not that it's unfixable. She paused. But I take your point about the years of neglect. Those are real. Cecil Pratt looked at her with the expression of a man recalibrating. You've been there 3 days, he said again. I have. And I've been in the rows, every one of them. She looked at Martha. Can you pull together what's on that list? I'd like to get back before the afternoon heat. Give me 20 minutes, Martha said, and there was something in her voice that Elena hadn't heard there before. She came back to find Silas on the west side of the property, trying to fix a section of trellis wire by himself. This was not, in itself, remarkable. What was notable was the way he was doing it, with a kind of furious concentration that had less to do with the wire and more to do with what happened when you stopped concentrating on the wire. She'd seen that before too. She knew the mechanism of it. She got down from the wagon and went to help without announcing herself. He glanced up when she took the opposite end of the wire to hold the tension while he worked the post. You don't have to. I've got it, she said. Tension's better with 2 people. He said nothing for a moment, then, practically, hold it at that height, don't let it slack. They worked in silence for a few minutes. The afternoon had gone warm. The desert sky, its usual brazen blue, a hawk circling something invisible to them high above the west ridge. Cecil Pratt talked to you, Silas said. Not a question. He was at the Mercantile. What did he say? What everyone says, apparently. She shifted her grip on the wire, that it's too far gone. And I told him the soil analysis. Silas's hands paused briefly in their work. What? The mineral content, the elevation advantage, the depth of the root systems. She watched him process that. He didn't have a rebuttal. He went back to the post. You don't have to defend this place to Cecil Pratt. I know. But he was wrong, and being wrong confidently in public has a way of becoming the truth if no one corrects it. She looked down the west rows. These were in better shape than the east, more recently tended. How many people in this town actually know what this property is capable of? He thought about it. Before, when Margaret was managing it, people knew. We had the Phoenix buyer coming out every year. We hosted a harvest celebration a few times. People came. He drove the post into the repaired socket with a strike that was sharper than it needed to be. Then she got sick, and then she was gone. And then he cut the sentence off. And then the place started looking like it looked. Yeah. And their opinion followed the appearance. Yeah. She let the wire tension settle into its new position. The repair held. She stepped back, brushing her hands on her work skirt. Silas. It was the first time she'd used his given name without the mister, and she felt him notice it. What do you actually want? Not financially, not practically. What do you want this place to be? He looked at the repaired wire, at the row stretching away from it, the vines in need of work, the mountains beyond the property line going purple in the late afternoon. I want it to be what it was supposed to be, he said. It came out low, like something he didn't say often. What she built it to be, something that lasts. Then we need to talk about the dead sections, Elena said. He looked at her. Not tonight, she said, but soon. Dinner that night was the first one that felt like something other than 2 strangers being careful around each other. She'd made a stew from what was in the kitchen. Not complicated, not extraordinary, but solid. He'd come in from the evening chores and washed up at the pump without being asked, and she'd noticed the small consideration of that. They ate without a lot of talk, but it was a different quality of quiet than it had been the night before. Less wary. Partway through the meal, he said without looking up from his bowl, the Grenache section, the one you found this morning with the live growth from the base. I pruned 6 more today. All of them had it. She looked up. 6 more with viable base growth? 6 more. He did look up then. You were right about the root systems. They're deeper than they look. She said nothing for a moment because the right thing to say was something like, I told you so, and that wasn't what this moment called for. That's good news, she said. It's the best news I've had in a while, he said quietly. And then, after a pause that felt like he was deciding something, thank you. for the way you looked at it. Most people look at this place and see what it is. You looked at it and saw what it was. He reconsidered. What it could be. It's the same thing, Elena said, if you look right. Outside, the desert night was settling over the vineyard, the stars coming up thick and certain over the ridgeline, the air finally losing the day's heat. The dead canes were still out there, and the debt was still in the ledger, and the town was still keeping its bets about how long she'd last. But 6 more plants had live roots, and somewhere in the house above them, a woman's work was still embedded in the living soil of this place, waiting for someone to see it. Elena picked up her fork and went back to her stew. Tomorrow, the west rows needed doing, and the trellis repair wasn't finished, and the soil amendments she'd bought from Martha needed to be worked in before the weekend if they were going to matter. There was a lot of work ahead. She found, to something like her own surprise, that she was looking forward to it. The sulfur and lime went into the east rows on a Friday, worked into the soil by hand because the ground was too uneven in places for any tool that needed a straight line. Elena did most of it herself, moving down the rows on her knees with a trowel, opening the earth around each base, and working the amendment in with the particular care you give something that is already on the edge of giving up. Silas did the outer rows, and she could hear him working, the rhythm of it, the scrape and turn of the trowel, even when she couldn't see him. It was hard, dull, necessary work, the kind that doesn't announce itself or look like much from a distance. By noon, her back was telling her things she didn't want to hear, and by mid-afternoon, her hands were raw enough that she wrapped them in strips of cloth she'd brought for that purpose. She hadn't mentioned the hands to Silas. He hadn't mentioned his, though she'd seen him flex his fingers once or twice with the expression of a man ignoring something. They ate lunch in the rows that day, sitting on the ground with their backs against a fence post, passing a canteen between them. He'd brought bread and dried beef from the kitchen without being asked, which she noted. Small organizational gestures, she was learning, were his way of being useful when he didn't have words ready. "We'll need more lime before we start on the west section," she said, looking at the row ahead of them. "I know." He tore a piece of bread in half without looking up. "I'll go to Pratt's tomorrow." She glanced at him. He'd been avoiding Pratt since her first trip to town, sending the ranch hand, a taciturn older man named Hector who had worked the property for 12 years and regarded Elena with neither hostility nor welcome, simply a flat observation that he seemed to reserve for all new things, when supplies were needed from the east end of Main Street. "You don't have to," she said. "Pratt's got the better price on lime. Martha marks it up." He took a drink from the canteen. "I've been avoiding the man because he makes me feel like I should apologize for still being here. That's my problem, not his." She didn't say anything to that because there wasn't anything useful to say, and he knew it as well as she did. "He's not wrong, technically," Silas said, in the tone of someone cleaning a wound. "The place has been going under, on the numbers he sees, where the outstanding accounts, what I owe the bank. He's looking at a failing operation." "He's looking at the numbers without looking at the vines," Elena said. "Most people can only see what's already happened." She considered that. It was true, and it was also slightly generous to Pratt, but she let it stand. They finished the east rows by the end of the following day, and the work shifted to the west section, and then to the long process of repairing the trellis wire along the north face of the property where the winter wind came hardest. November was moving in. The mornings had started going genuinely cold, the kind of desert cold that surprised people who thought desert and heat were the same thing. Elena added a second layer under her work coat and found a pair of leather gloves in the barn that fit reasonably well and belonged, she suspected from their smallness, to Margaret Mercer. She used them without asking. He didn't mention it. The nights were the hardest part, and not for the reasons she'd expected. The work itself she could handle. The physical exhaustion of it was actually something like relief, the deep tiredness of a body that had been used fully, which was better than the restless tiredness of a body with nothing to do. What she hadn't anticipated was the quiet of the desert nights in that small room, the darkness outside the window and the stars so numerous and indifferent, the particular ache of a life being rebuilt from the ground up in a place that didn't know her yet. She wrote in her journal most nights. Not narrative, mostly. Lists, observations, things she needed to remember. The composition of the soil in different sections, which plants had responded well to the amendment, what needed to be done before the first freeze, practical things in her practical handwriting. Once, near the middle of November, she wrote, Strange to care this much about something that isn't mine. And then she stared at that for a while and wasn't sure what to do with it, so she closed the journal and went to sleep. Hector, the ranch hand, warmed to her incrementally, and according to no logic she could identify. For the first 2 weeks, he spoke to her only in functional sentences. There's a loose post on the south fence. The irrigation ditch on the east side is running slow. Then one morning, she came out to find him already in the Grenache section, carefully clearing dead wood from the base of plants the way she'd been doing, without having been asked. She worked beside him for an hour before he said, without any preamble, "My wife does a thing with dried chilies and pork that would fix those hands of yours. The oil's in the chilies." She looked at her hands, still raw in places, despite the gloves. "Tell her I'd appreciate that," Elena said. "She lives in town. I'll bring you some Friday." He kept working. "You're doing it right, by the way. The clearing. Most people rush it." That was the longest thing he'd said to her in 2 weeks. She counted it. The conversation about the dead sections happened on a cold Thursday evening in the third week of November. Because Elena decided that some conversations shouldn't be waited for, they needed to be started before the person was ready, because readiness was sometimes just another word for avoidance. She put the ledger on the table between them after dinner and opened it to a page she'd been preparing for 3 days. He looked at it, then at her. "What is this?" "A proposal," she said. "I want you to look at it before you react." "That's not a reassuring opening." "I know." She turned the ledger toward him. She'd made a diagram, rough, done in pencil, not pretty, of the Vineyard sections. The east block, the west block, the north face. And in the center, the section she'd marked in careful cross-hatching, the 12 acres of oldest, most compromised vines, the ones producing so little they were functionally negative, taking water and resources and giving back almost nothing. Silas looked at it for a long time. "You want to pull them," he said quietly. "Those 12 acres specifically, the ones I've marked. That's a third of the viable land." "It's a third of the land that looks viable," she corrected. "Those vines produced under 400 pounds per acre last harvest, according to your records. 400 pounds is nothing, and they're struggling enough that they're affecting the root competition in the rows around them. The stronger plants nearby are working against those old root systems." He stood up from the table and went to the window. She let him. Outside, the vineyard was dark, and the cold had settled in hard, the sky cloudless and brilliant in the way the desert got in November. "Those are the original plantings," he said, "the ones Margaret put in when we first built this place." She knew that. She'd known it when she started preparing the proposal, and she'd spent 2 days deciding whether to know it out loud or not. "I know," she said. "She planted those herself, dug the holes." "Silas." She kept her voice level because this moment needed level, not soft. "She planted them to grow a vineyard, not to be preserved. There's a difference." He was quiet for a moment that had weight in it. "What would go in?" he finally said. It came out rough at the edges. "Tempranillo, and one section of Malvasia for the white wine market. The Phoenix buyer has been expanding that direction. I checked the correspondence in your files." She paused. "They'd take 3 years to first production, closer to 5 for real quality. But in those 5 years, the rest of the vineyard improves because it's not fighting the dead weight. And when they come in strong. 3 to 5 years. He turned from the window. The bank gets managed with what the healthy sections produce in the meantime, if we can bring those up to something real." She leaned forward. "The strong vines are being held back. Fix the soil, fix the competition, fix the trellis support so they can grow properly. I think you can get those sections to triple current yield. That covers the banknote. Barely, but it covers it." He looked at her. "You think?" "I think," she confirmed. She wasn't going to lie to him about certainty. "I know the soil. I know what I've seen in those rows. But I'm not going to tell you it's guaranteed because nothing is guaranteed and you know that as well as I do." He sat back down at the table slowly, looked at the diagram with the cross-hatching where his wife's original planting stood. "If we pull those sections and the replanting doesn't work," he said, "or if the remaining vines don't produce what you're predicting, then we lose the estate," Elena said. "I know. Say it clearly." She met his eyes. "If this goes wrong, you lose everything. The bank takes the property. That is the actual risk." He held her gaze for a long moment. Outside, the wind had come up, and she could hear the dry rattle of canes against the trellis wire. that sound that had started to feel, in the weeks since she'd arrived, less like something dying and more like something restless. "Why are you doing this?" he said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a genuine question, the kind that comes out when a man is trying to understand something that doesn't have a simple answer. "You've been here 3 weeks. This isn't your land. If it goes under, you walk away." Elena was quiet for a moment. "I walked away from the last thing," she said. "Not by choice. I would have fought for it if there had been anything to fight for." She looked down at the diagram. "There is something to fight for here. The soil, the vines, the location. It's real. It should be something." She paused. "And I'm tired of arriving at places and leaving them the same as they were." He was quiet long enough that she thought he might not answer. Then, low and definite, "All right." She looked up. "We do it your way," he said. "We pull the sections." The pulling began the following week. It was brutal work. Not physically. Well, physically too, because removing established grapevines with root systems 4 and 5 feet deep required full effort and the stubbornness to keep going when the root gave you nothing back for the first hour. But the other kind of brutal, the kind she watched on Silas's face when he took the first plant by the base and began working it loose from the ground. He didn't say anything. He just worked. She stayed in the row beside him and didn't say anything either, and the sound of the work was enough to fill the silence. They did it over 4 days, with Hector helping on the 3rd and 4th. The removed vines were piled at the edge of the property, and on the 5th day, Silas burned them. And Elena stood at a distance and watched the smoke go up and didn't make it mean anything except what it was: old wood that had finished its work. The first week of December brought a frost. Not the devastating hard freeze that could kill established vines, but the serious kind. Temperatures dropping below 25 in the hours before dawn, the ground going white and hard, the remaining vines in the untouched sections clattering in the cold with a sound different from their usual movement. Elena was up well before dawn those mornings, out in the rows with a lantern, checking the soil temperature, feeling the canes for ice damage. Silas had started getting up with her. This had not been decided or discussed. The first frost morning, she'd come downstairs to find him already at the stove, coffee made, boots on. She'd looked at him. He'd handed her a cup and said East rose first, and that had been that. They developed a pattern in those cold weeks that had the particular efficiency of people who'd figured out how to be in the same space without having to narrate it. She handled the vine assessment. He handled the infrastructure, checking trellis supports, making sure the irrigation lines hadn't cracked in the freeze, patching the insulation they'd wrapped around the youngest sections. They ate together 3 times a day. They talked about the vineyard constantly and about other things in the irregular, incomplete way that people talk when they're occupied with something larger than conversation. She learned things about him, sidelong, the way you learn things about someone you're working alongside rather than talking at. He had a temper that he kept on a very short leash. She could see it in the way his jaw set sometimes, in the particular quality of his silences when something went wrong. He was stubborn in a way that went so deep it had probably calcified into something like a virtue. He had opinions about wine that were specific and occasionally surprising. He didn't like overly tannic reds, preferred something with what he called a long end, meaning the finish that stayed with you. He'd been married at 26, younger than most men in the territory waited. He'd met Margaret at a harvest celebration on a neighboring property, and from what Elena gathered between the lines of the things he said and the things he didn't say, it had been the kind of relationship that remade a person so fundamentally that losing it was like losing the version of yourself that had existed inside it. She understood that, more than she'd expected to. One evening in mid-December, he found her in the root cellar. She'd been reorganizing the stored equipment down there, trying to get a full inventory of what tools they had versus what they needed. And he stood in the doorway and said, "I found something I think you should see." He led her to the small stone room attached to the east side of the barn, the one she'd identified on her first day as possibly a fermentation room. He unlocked the door with a key that lived on a hook inside the barn, and inside, against the far wall, was a row of barrels she hadn't seen before, half hidden behind stacked crates. "These are from the last real harvest," he said, 3 years ago. "I put them in and then I didn't do anything with them. Didn't bottle, didn't sell." He moved toward the barrels and rested a hand on the closest one. "I don't know if they're still any good. I haven't opened them. She looked at the barrels. 6 of them, good-sized old French oak from the look of them. 3 years in oak. A wine that had been finished and stored and then abandoned along with everything else when he'd stopped being able to manage what the grief required of him. Open one, she said. Now? Do you have a better time? He found the equipment, a wine thief, a long glass tube for extracting wine from the barrel without disturbing the whole thing, and 2 clean glasses that he produced from a wooden box on the shelf with a care that made her think they'd been stored there deliberately, kept clean against a future he'd maybe stopped believing in. He drew the sample himself, with the practiced ease of someone who'd done this many times and then stopped doing it. She watched the wine come up dark and clear into the glass. A deep ruby, the color of something that had been working in the dark for a long time. He handed her the glass first. She brought it up and breathed it. The first thing, always, before the taste. What came off it was not what she'd expected from a barrel that had been sitting untended in a locked room for 3 years. There was fruit in it, still, something dark and layered, with a secondary note that was earthy in a way that felt intentional. There was tannin structure. There was the mineral quality she'd felt in the soil. She tasted it. It was imperfect. There was some roughness in the finish, a little heat that suggested it could have used more attention during aging. But beneath the imperfections, there was something real and good. Something that had continued becoming itself in the dark without anyone watching. She set the glass down and looked at him. He was watching her face with the expression of a man who'd prepared himself for bad news and didn't quite know what to do with the alternative. "Silas," she said, "this is good." He didn't say anything for a moment. "It needs work," she said, because she wasn't going to let him mistake her for someone who exaggerated. The finish is rough, and it needed more attention than it got. But the base of it, what the wine actually is, that's real. That's from real fruit and real soil. She picked the glass back up. If you'd been here to manage the aging, this would have been something your Phoenix buyer would have paid well for. He looked at his own glass, picked it up, drank without the professional ceremony of it, just a man tasting something he'd made and left and come back to. "It tastes like 3 years ago," he said quietly. She didn't say anything to that. "It was a good harvest," he said, "the last real one. Margaret had been gone about 6 months. I didn't know—" He stopped. "I didn't know how to keep going, but the vines didn't know that, so they just did what they did. Produced anyway." He looked at the barrel. "I put it up and locked the door and told myself I'd deal with it later. Later kept not coming." Elena looked at the row of barrels. 6 of them, 3 years of wine that had kept becoming itself in the dark, in a locked room, without anyone watching. "We could bottle what's usable," she said. "Some of it might be past saving, but not all. If we get it right." "The Phoenix buyer," he said, "and anyone else worth talking to." He was quiet for a moment, then, with a care that had something fragile in it, "You really think the vineyard can come back?" It wasn't quite a question. "I think it already is," Elena said. Outside the small stone room, the December wind was working through the vineyard, and the bare canes on the newly cleared sections made a different sound than the others. An open, waiting kind of sound, the way a field sounds before planting, when the ground has been prepared and everything is possibility, and nothing is certain. She finished her glass in the cold of the fermentation room, standing beside a man who was slowly learning to believe in his own land again, and thought about what it meant to bet everything you had on something that had no guarantee. She'd done it once already, with Thomas and the life she'd built in Socorro, and lost. She was doing it again here, in a different way, with a different kind of stake. The difference she was beginning to understand was that here she had evidence. The soil was real. The wine in the glass was real. The live growth she'd found buried under 3 years of dead wood was real. You could lose on real things the same as you could lose on nothing. She knew that. But at least when you lost on something real, you'd been right to try. She set her glass on the shelf and went back out into the cold, where there was still work to do before dark. January came in without apology. The temperature dropped 14 degrees in a single night in the first week of the new year, and Elena woke at 2 in the morning to a cold so sharp it had gotten through the window glass and settled into the room like something with weight. She was dressed and out the door in 4 minutes, lantern in hand, moving fast toward the east rows where the youngest soil amendments made the vines most vulnerable to a hard freeze of this kind. Silas was already there. He was working by lantern light, too, moving down the row with a burlap sack over his shoulder, packing insulation around the base of the vines they'd identified as most at risk. He'd been doing it since before she woke. She could see by the progress he'd made that he'd been out here at least 40 minutes, maybe longer, which meant he'd woken somewhere around 1 and hadn't thought to get her. "Why didn't you—" she started. "I didn't want to wake you unless it was worse than I thought," he said, without stopping. "It's worse than I thought." She took the second burlap sack from the barn door where he'd left it and started on the row across from him. The ground under her boots was iron hard, the frost having gotten into the top 2 inches of soil and locked it. The thermometer on the barn wall read 19 degrees. 19 was the number she'd been afraid of since November, the threshold below which the damage stopped being correctable and started being permanent. They worked without talking, which was the only efficient way to work. She could hear her own breathing in the cold, see it in the lantern light, and the sound of the vineyard around them was different in a freeze. The canes didn't rattle the same way. They made a brittle, glassy sound when the wind moved them, as if they'd been made of something that could shatter. Hector arrived at 3:30. She didn't know how he'd known. The man lived 2 miles toward town in a small adobe with his wife, and neither she nor Silas had sent word. But he came through the gate with his own lantern and went directly to the north face without asking what needed doing, because he'd been on this property 12 years and knew what a hard freeze required. They worked until first light. By the time the sun came up, thin and cold, offering light without much warmth, they'd insulated the most vulnerable sections, covered the new Tempranillo cuttings they'd heeled in for early spring planting with canvas weighted down at the corners with rocks, and diverted what little they could of the irrigation water to run slow through the most exposed rows, the moving water holding a few degrees more warmth than still ground. Elena stood at the end of the east rows in the early morning light and tried to read the damage. Some of it was visible already. Canes that had gone from flexible to stiff in the wrong way, a brittleness in the tips that would show itself fully in a few days when the tissue either recovered or didn't. Other damage wouldn't show for 2 weeks, when the growing season tried to push forward and the injured wood couldn't answer. "How bad?" Silas said. He was beside her, steam coming off him in the cold, his coat darkened at the shoulders where he'd knelt in the frosted ground for hours. "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "We did what we could. The Grenache sections, they're old enough and deep enough that I think they'll be all right. It's the East Block, the ones we amended in November. Those I'm not sure about. If we lose those—" "Let's see what we lose before we count it," she said. He looked at her sideways, and she knew what was in the look. Not challenge, more like the grim recognition of 2 people who've just rolled a number and are waiting for the dice to settle. "Coffee," she said, "and then you need to sleep for a few hours. You were out here before I was." "So were you, technically." "I was out here 4 minutes after I woke up. You were out here before 2. There's a difference." She picked up her lantern. "Hector can keep watch. You're no good to anyone functioning on that little." He looked like he was going to argue, did the math on it, and didn't. The damage showed itself over the following 2 weeks, and it was not nothing. 3 rows in the East Block had taken the kind of injury that would set them back. Not dead, but compromised enough that their contribution to the spring harvest would be minimal. 2 more rows had some tip damage that would cost them some vigor, but would recover by midsummer. The Grenache sections had done what she'd hoped. The deep root systems had held enough thermal mass to carry the plants through the worst hours, and the damage there was superficial. Net result, they'd lost maybe 15% of what she'd projected from the East Block, which was not catastrophic, which was also not nothing, against a financial margin that had no room for anything. She put the numbers in the ledger that evening and looked at them for a long time. Silas came to look over her shoulder, read the figures, and said nothing for a moment. "Still enough?" he asked. "Barely." She tapped the pencil against the page. "If the Grenache comes in the way it should, and I think it will, the root systems are strong, and if the West Block holds through the rest of winter, and if the spring is wet enough in March and April, that's a lot of ifs. Vineyards are a lot of ifs," she said. "Anyone who tells you different is selling something." He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. He had the look of a man who'd slept some, not enough, and had been running the numbers in his head without the ledger all day. "The banknote comes due in August," he said. "I know. If the harvest is what you're projecting, the Phoenix contract covers it. If the harvest is 20% less than you're projecting, we talked to the bank about an extension. James Whitfield at the Tucson branch, I've read the correspondence, he's been patient." "Patient has limits," Silas said. "So does everything." He looked at her across the table in the lamplight, and there was something in the look that was different from the early looks, the ones that had been evaluation or wariness, or the particular flatness of a man keeping himself from feeling things. This look had some of the flatness worn away, not replaced by anything easy, just more visible, the way bedrock looks after water has been working at the topsoil for a while. "Elena," he said, "what happens to you if this fails?" She considered that. Not the answer. She'd thought about the answer before, in the night when the desert quiet pressed down, but the fact that he was asking it, that he'd gotten to a place where her outcome was a thing he thought about. "I find the next thing," she said, just like that. "I've done it before." "That doesn't mean it's easy," he said. He was looking at her with that bedrock look. "I know what you left. Martha told me, not the details, just that you'd come from a hard loss. I haven't asked because it didn't seem like mine to ask." "It isn't," she said, gently but directly. "I know." He held her gaze. "I'm asking anyway." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the January night was doing what January did here, pressing its cold weight against the walls, the wind finding every gap in the adobe and announcing it. "Thomas wasn't a bad man," she said finally. He managed things to a certain point, and when they got past that point, he let them go rather than ask for help. The house, the business. By the time I knew how bad it was, there was nothing left to fight for." She looked at the ledger. "I knew what was coming about 2 months before it did, and I had to just sit there and watch it because there was nothing I could do about it." "That's its own kind of grief," he said. "It is." She closed the ledger. "What I have here is different. Here, there's something to do about it. Every day there is something I can do about it." She looked at him. "That matters more than you might think, after the other kind." He didn't say anything to that, but he stayed at the table for a while after she went to check the stove for the night, and she could see the light under the kitchen door for a long time before she slept. February thawed slow and irregular, the way desert winters did. Cold one week, almost warm the next. The temperature swinging in ways that kept her checking the vines constantly, because plants on the edge of a season didn't know what to believe and sometimes started moving at the wrong signal. The new cuttings they'd healed in for the replanted sections needed daily monitoring, checking the union points where the grafts would take or not take, watching for the particular kind of stress that looked like growth but wasn't. The work had changed in character from the fall work. The fall had been about damage assessment and damage control, understanding what was broken and deciding what to do about it. The winter work was about maintenance and patience, which was harder in its own way because it required accepting that some things simply couldn't be hurried. You could not make a graft take faster by watching it. You could not make a vine establish itself in deep soil through force of intention. You prepared the conditions and you maintained them, and you waited. Elena was not naturally a patient person. She was a person who had learned patience because the alternative was going crazy, and there was a difference. Silas was worse at waiting than she was, which she hadn't expected. He was a deliberate man, slow in his movements and his speech, and she'd taken that for patience. What it actually was, she came to understand, was control. The careful management of energy by a man who knew he had a temper and had spent years keeping it on the leash. Under the deliberateness, there was an urgency that ran close to the surface, and the winter waiting fed it. She found ways to keep them both occupied with productive work during the weeks when the vines themselves demanded little. They bottled the recoverable barrels from the fermentation room, 4 of the 6, the other 2 having gone too far past saving. It was a painstaking process, the filtering and fining and bottling, and it required a kind of sustained attention that was good for both of them, occupying the hands while the mind did other things. She labeled the bottles herself, in her careful handwriting. Mercer Estate, Harlan Creek, Arizona Territory. Harvest 1880. 3 years old, aged in French oak, imperfect and real, and made from soil that nobody in the wine business had bothered to take seriously yet. "These need to go somewhere," she said, looking at the crates of finished bottles on the fermentation room floor. "The Phoenix buyer won't come until spring," Silas said. "I know. But these don't have to wait for the Phoenix buyer." She looked at him. "The Haverford Hotel in Tucson. They have a dining room that serves half the territorial government and all of the railroad money that comes through. They buy wine, good wine, from legitimate operations." She paused. "This is legitimate wine from a legitimate operation. It just happens to be from Arizona instead of California. Arizona wine isn't yet," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at the crates, at the bottles with her handwriting on the labels. "You want to drive to Tucson," he said. "I want to drive to Tucson," she confirmed, "and I want to sell these to someone who can put them on a table where people with money and opinions will drink them and form an opinion." She held his gaze. "The spring harvest is still 4 months away. We can't afford to leave anything on the table." He was quiet for a moment with that calculation running behind his eyes. "I'll hitch the wagon," he said. The drive to Tucson was a long day in each direction, and they went on a Tuesday when Hector could watch the property. The wagon bed held the 4 crates of bottled wine wrapped in burlap against the road, and they drove through the desert in a cold that didn't quit until they dropped 500 feet in elevation closer to the city. Tucson in February was its own kind of world, larger than Harlan Creek in ways that were apparent in every direction, noisier, with the energy of a territorial capital doing its business. Elena had last been through it on the stage to Harlan Creek, when she'd been looking at it through the window with $11 and a name on a piece of paper. It felt different from the wagon seat, different from the vantage point of someone who was there on purpose, with a thing to sell. The Haverford Hotel was on the main street, 4 stories of the most architectural ambition the territory had assembled in one place. They brought a case inside as a sample and asked for the manager. The manager was a compact man named Howard Fells, in his 40s, with the look of someone who had learned to assess things very quickly because his job required constant assessments. He looked at the case, at Elena, at Silas, at the label on the bottle with the measure of a man deciding what category of person he was dealing with. "Arizona wine," he said. He didn't make it a question, but the inflection gave it the quality of one. "Mercer Estate, Harlan Creek," Elena said. "Elevation 4,200 feet. Grenache, aged 3 years in French oak. We'd like you to taste it." Fells produced a glass from behind the bar with the automatic efficiency of a man who'd done this before. He opened the bottle, poured a measure, examined the color with the professional attention of someone who'd learned to look properly, and tasted it. He was quiet for a moment that stretched out long enough that Silas, beside her, shifted his weight almost imperceptibly. "That's rough in the finish," Fells said. "It is," Elena agreed. "It was undermanaged in the final aging period. We know that." He looked at her, not dismissively, with a kind of recalibration. He'd expected defense. "But the base of the wine is solid," she continued. "The fruit is real. The structure is real. This came from soil that has no business producing something this good, and it did it anyway because the elevation and the temperature variation here work the same way they do in regions people have been paying attention to for 100 years. She paused. "The spring harvest is going to be better than this because we're in the rows. The next vintage won't have this finish problem." Fells looked at the glass again, took another taste. "How many cases?" he said. They sold him 18 cases at a price that made Silas go briefly still on the drive back, the way a person goes still when something they'd stopped hoping for happens anyway. "That covers 2 months of bank interest," he said, about 10 miles outside Tucson. "And leaves enough to buy the spring equipment we need before I have to decide what to delay," Elena said. He was quiet for a mile or two. The desert spread out around them in the late afternoon light, vast and indifferent and beautiful in its own harsh way. "You knew he'd buy it," Silas said. "I thought he'd buy it." "There's a difference." "I know, but I wasn't going to say that before we went in." He looked at the road ahead. "No," he said. "I suppose you weren't." And there was something in his voice that wasn't quite amusement and wasn't quite admiration, but was somewhere in the neighborhood of both. March came in with the rain they needed, slow-soaking rains that got into the soil properly instead of running off the top of it, And the vineyard responded the way a thirsty thing responds to water, visibly, urgently, with new growth pushing out from the canes on the established sections in the first week of warm weather. The replanted sections showed the first signs of graft take in the Tempranillo cuttings, small green flags of new growth at the union points that Elena checked every morning with the attention of someone reading dispatches from a difficult front. It was in the second week of March that she found the letter. It had come with the weekly mail, brought out by the boy Silas paid to run the post from town every Thursday. Among the usual accounts and correspondence was an envelope with a return address she didn't recognize. A business address in Phoenix from a company called Voss and Partners, wine merchants and regional buyers. She left it on the table for Silas to open, which was the correct thing to do. She stood in the kitchen pretending to check something on the stove while he sat down, opened it, and read it. The silence after he finished reading had a quality to it. "Voss and Partners," he said. She turned around. His face had the expression of a man who's just been shown a map to somewhere he thought didn't exist. "I know the name," she said carefully. "They heard about the Haverford sale. Fells apparently told someone, who told someone else, and it got to their buyer who covers the territorial market." He set the letter on the table and looked at it. "They want to come see the property, before the harvest." Elena stood very still. "They want to come see the property," she repeated. "Spring visit. They're touring regional operations. They've added us to the itinerary." He looked up. "Elena, Voss and Partners did $40,000 of business last year with California operations alone. They have East Coast distribution, New York, Boston." She sat down across from him. The weight of what he'd just said settled over the kitchen like a change in barometric pressure, the kind you feel in your ears before a storm. Voss and Partners wasn't the Phoenix buyer who came every year by habit and contract obligation. Voss and Partners was a different order of thing entirely. A buyer like that didn't just purchase a harvest. A buyer like that changed what a vineyard was. "When?" she said. "Late April, before the harvest comes in." She looked at the letter, at his hands on either side of it, at the kitchen around them, the worn table, the stove she'd learned to manage, the window with the view of the east rows where the Grenache was already putting out new growth in the March warmth. "That gives us 6 weeks," she said. "To do what? To make this place look like what it's becoming instead of what it's been." She looked at him. "The north fence, the irrigation channels on the west side, the fermentation room. It needs to be presentable. And the rows that are replanted," she was already calculating. "We can't make them look established because they aren't, but we can make them look intentional, which they are. Elena." His voice had something careful in it. "What if they come and it's not enough? They're coming because of the Haverford sale, one case of undermanaged 3-year-old wine. If the property doesn't, then it doesn't," she said. "But we're going to make sure it does." She picked up the letter and read it herself, beginning to end, the formal language of a business proposition that was also the kind of thing a person sometimes spent their whole life without ever receiving. "They're coming because the wine was real," she said. "The property is real. The soil is real. We just have to make sure they can see it." He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the March wind moved through the rows, and the new growth on the Grenache sections bent and straightened with it, the small green of it catching the afternoon light. "We've got 6 weeks, he said finally. 6 weeks, she confirmed. "Then we better get started." She set the letter back on the table between them. The lamplight caught the edge of it, the return address in its careful print, Voss and Partners, Phoenix, Arizona Territory. And outside the window, the vineyard was doing what it had been doing all along, in the cold and the frost and the long patient work of restoration. It was growing. Not perfectly, not without damage, not in the way anyone looking at it 6 months ago would have predicted. But it was growing, and that was everything. 6 weeks was not enough time. It was, however, the time they had. And Elena had learned by now that the difference between enough time and the time you have is mostly a question of what you decide to prioritize and what you decide to let go. She made a list the morning after the letter arrived and pinned it to the wall above the kitchen work table where she could see it without looking for it. Not a list of everything that needed doing. That list would have been demoralizing in its length. But a list of what a buyer from Voss and Partners would actually see and judge when he walked this property. The rows. The fermentation room. the soil condition in the established sections, the evidence of a plan in the replanted sections, the wine itself, which was the thing everything else was scaffolding for. The north fence they repaired in the first week, Silas and Hector pulling and replacing the worst posts while Elena worked the irrigation channels on the west side, clearing the slow accumulation of silt and debris that had been reducing flow through the driest section of the property. The fermentation room she cleaned herself, top to bottom, over 2 days, scrubbing the stone walls, organizing the equipment on the shelves, with a logic that would communicate competence to someone who knew what they were looking at, making sure the remaining bottles of the 1880 vintage were stored correctly. She didn't try to make the property look like something it wasn't. That had been a consideration she'd turned over carefully and set aside. A buyer from an operation the size of Voss and Partners had seen enough properties to recognize the difference between a place that had been cleaned up for a visit and a place that was actually being managed. She wanted them to see the latter. What that meant, practically, was that the replanted sections needed to look like a decision rather than a desperation. She built simple marker stakes for the Tempranillo rows, labeled with the variety and the planting date in her clear hand, and beside each row she left the soil notes she'd been keeping, the amendment records, the graph take percentages, the projected production timeline. If they asked about the cleared sections, she wanted the answer to be readable in the land itself. Silas threw himself into the preparation with an energy she hadn't seen from him before. Focused, directed, without the undertow of grief that had been pulling at everything he did in the fall. She noticed it without commenting on it, the way you notice when weather changes. One morning she came out to find he'd repaired the barn doors that had been hanging wrong since she'd arrived, rehanging them on new hardware so they opened and closed properly for the first time in what looked like years. Small thing, not on any list, but when she ran her hand over the new hinges and felt them move right, she understood what it was. A man reclaiming his own property, piece by piece, not just for the buyer but for himself. That was different from what he'd been doing in October. Cecil Pratt came to the property for the first time in 2 years on a Thursday in the 3rd week of March. She saw the wagon coming up the track and recognized the horse before she recognized the driver. A bay gelding with a white sock that she'd seen tied outside Pratt's feed store every time she'd been to town. She set down the pruning saw she'd been using on the west rows and waited. He climbed down from the wagon with the deliberate movements of a man who'd made a decision about something and was committed to it. He was wearing a better coat than the one he'd had on in Martha's Mercantile in November, which she noted. "Mr. Pratt," she said. "Mrs. Hartwell." He looked around, at the repaired fence line, at the west rows which were putting out new growth along the properly supported trellis wire, at the cleared east section where the new stakes stood in their even lines. He took it in without saying anything for a long moment. Silas came around the corner of the barn and stopped when he saw Pratt. Something moved through his expression. Old friction, familiar and automatic. He managed it. "Cecil," he said. "Silas." Pratt looked at him. "Heard about the Haverford sale. Word travels. Also heard about Voss and Partners." He said it without elaboration, waiting to see how it landed. Silas kept his face neutral, which Elena knew was costing him something. "Where'd you hear that?" "Howard Fells knows Robert Voss personally. He mentioned it to someone who mentioned it to someone." Pratt looked at the rows again. He had the expression of a man recalculating, not entirely comfortable with it, but honest enough to do it. "The place looks different from the last time I was out here." "It is different," Silas said, "from the last time you were out here." A silence that had some history in it. "I wasn't wrong about where it was headed," Pratt said. He was a man who needed to be accurate about his record. Elena could see that. "When I said what I said in November, the numbers were what they were." "The numbers were what they were," Silas agreed. "But I may have been wrong about where it was capable of going." He said it like it cost him something, because it did. Men like Pratt kept careful accounts of what they'd predicted and what had happened, and a divergence between the two required acknowledgement before the ledger could be corrected. "I wanted to come say that in person." She hadn't expected that. She stood with her pruning saw and watched the two men have this exchange. The old antagonism in the air between them, banged up and reshaped by the intervening months, and felt the particular weight of a small town reconsidering something. "I appreciate that," Silas said finally. And he meant it. She could hear that he meant it. Pratt nodded once, looked at Elena directly. "You know what you're doing. he said. I was wrong about that too. He said it with the flatness of a statement of fact rather than a compliment, which was more useful. Thank you, she said. He got back in his wagon and drove back down the track, and she and Silas stood watching it go. That, Silas said, is the closest Cecil Pratt has come to an apology in 20 years of my knowing him. I know, Elena said. She picked up her pruning saw. Back to work. The week before the Voss buyer was due to arrive, Elena stopped sleeping properly. Not insomnia, exactly. She went to bed at the reasonable hour that hard physical labor required, and she was genuinely tired, but she woke at 3 or 4 in the mornings and lay in the dark listening to the Vineyard and running numbers. The Grenache sections were strong. She'd been through them row by row, and she believed in what she was seeing. The West Block had come through the winter better than she'd projected after the January freeze, the established vines there producing the kind of dense new growth that preceded a strong harvest. The replanted sections were obviously not producing this year, but that was honest and expected. The fermentation room held the last 12 bottles of the 1880 vintage, set out on the shelf she'd cleaned. The thing she couldn't calculate was the buyer himself. His name was James Aldrich, according to the follow-up correspondence. Regional buyer for Voss and Partners, based in San Francisco, covering the Western Territories as the company expanded its sourcing operation. That was all she knew. She'd tried to find out more through the network of correspondence that Arizona Territory ran on. Martha Gillum knew someone in Tucson who dealt with the San Francisco operation, and the characterization she'd gotten back was brief. Particular man, knows what he's looking for, doesn't waste time on what he isn't. That was fine. She didn't want to waste his time either. What she wanted, waking at 4 in the morning in her small room with the east rose visible through the window in the dark, was a fair hearing. Just that. She'd done the work. The land had done its part. She wanted someone with the authority to say this is real to come and say it, so that the reality of it could stop being a matter of local opinion and become a matter of record. She said none of this to Silas. He was running his own internal calculations, and she could see it in him. The way he'd gotten quieter in the week before Aldrich's arrival, more deliberate, the leash on the underlying urgency pulled tighter. One evening, she found him at the kitchen table with one of Margaret's old Vineyard journals open in front of him, a record of the early years, the planting decisions, the first harvests. He wasn't reading it exactly, more like sitting with it. She made coffee and brought him a cup and didn't ask. She would have handled this better than me, he said. He was looking at the journal, not at her. Handled what better? The waiting. He turned a page without reading it. She was patient, genuinely patient, not the kind where you're just holding yourself still and hoping no one notices. He turned another page. She'd be out there in the rows right now, talking to the vines like they were going to answer. Elena sat across from him with her own cup. Did it work? The talking? He almost smiled. I used to think she was ridiculous. Then I started doing it myself. He closed the journal. Don't tell Hector. Hector probably already does it, she said. He looked at her. That almost smile again, and something else underneath it. The kind of look a man gives when someone has said something that landed in a place he wasn't expecting. Are you scared? She asked. She didn't usually ask things that directly, but it was 11 o'clock and she was tired, and the question had been sitting in the room for a while. He thought about it honestly, which she appreciated. Yeah, he said. Not the way I was scared in January. That was practical scared. I knew what we stood to lose, and I was doing the math in real time. He looked for the word. This is the kind of scared you get when something good might actually happen, which sounds wrong. It doesn't, she said. It's worse in some ways, bad things you can brace for. Good things catch you with your hands down. He looked at her across the table and the lamp between them, and something in the look had the quality of a door that had been closed for a long time, standing slightly open. What do you want? He said. After. Whatever happens with Aldrich, after that. What do you want? She thought about that question, the same question he'd turned back on her, the way she'd turned it on him in November. What do you actually want? I want to see the Tempranillo come in, she said. 3 years from now, when the replanted sections reach first production. I want to see what they do in this soil. She paused. I want to still be here for that. He held her gaze. You could be, he said. quiet and careful. If you wanted to be. The sentence sat in the kitchen between them with more weight than its words. She didn't answer it that night, not because she didn't know what she thought. She was beginning to know what she thought, had been beginning to know it for some time in the way you know things you haven't said yet, but because the night before the Voss buyer arrived was not the right moment for that conversation. Some things needed to be said on the right day, and this wasn't it. Get some sleep, she said. Tomorrow matters. He nodded, stood up. At the kitchen doorway, he stopped and looked back at her, and there was something in the look that was not quite what it had been in October, when he'd been evaluating whether she'd be useful. It was something quieter and less guarded than that. "Elena," he said. She looked up. "Thank you," he said, "for everything that's already happened, whatever tomorrow is." She held his gaze for a moment. "Go sleep," she said. James Aldrich arrived on a Tuesday in the last week of April, driving a hired buggy from town, and he was nothing like what she'd imagined and exactly what Martha's contact had described. A precise, compact man in his late 40s, dressed in the practical clothes of someone who spent significant time in the field rather than an office, with the calm, attentive manner of a person who made his living by observation and had gotten good at it. He shook Silas's hand and Elena's hand with equal briskness, and looked at the property from the front gate with the evaluating silence of someone running an initial calculation. "The elevation is higher than I expected," he said. 4,200 feet, Elena said. "The temperature variation between day and night during growing season runs 12 to 18 degrees in a good year." He looked at her. "You've been tracking it?" "Since October. I have the records." He nodded once and said, "Show me the rows." She took him through the established Grenache sections first, because that was where the story started. In the oldest part of the vineyard, the part that had been here longest, survived the most, and come through the winter with root systems that went down far enough to make a serious grower pay attention. She showed him the base growth she'd found in November, the vigorous canes that had come up from root systems buried under years of dead wood. He crouched and felt the soil the way she'd crouched and felt the soil 6 months ago, and she watched him do it and waited. "Good mineral content," he said. "Deep rocky subsoil," she said. "The drainage is natural on this slope. The east face gets morning sun and afternoon shade, which, in this climate, is actually the right orientation." He stood up and looked down the row. "What are you getting per acre in a good year on this section?" "I don't have a full year's data yet. I've been here since October." She met his gaze directly. "What I have is soil data, root health assessment, and vine condition. The projections I'd give you are based on comparable soil profiles from growing regions with similar characteristics. I can show you my methodology." "Later," he said. "Show me the rest first." She took him through the west block, which was looking strong. The trellis repairs had held through the spring growth, the vines putting out healthy cane development along the wire in the way that indicated good root establishment below. He asked technical questions as they moved through the rows, about rootstock, about training methods, about the pruning approach she'd taken in December, and she answered them without embellishment, giving him what she knew and identifying what she didn't know without trying to paper over the gaps. Silas walked with them and said relatively little, which was the right call. This wasn't his territory, the technical conversation, and he knew it. He answered questions about the property history when Aldrich asked them, directly and without softening the difficult parts. When Aldrich asked about the years of reduced management, Silas told him plainly what had happened. The loss of his wife, the years he'd let things slide, the condition the property had been in when Elena arrived. He said it without drama or self-pity, just a man being accurate about his record. Aldrich listened to it with the face of someone filing information. Then they came to the replanted sections. Aldrich stopped at the first row of Tempranillo and looked at the young plants with their marker stakes and the soil notes Elena had left beside them. He picked up the nearest note and read it. Then the next one. He moved down the row reading them in sequence, while she and Silas stood at the end and waited. He came back to them with 3 of the notes in his hand. "This was your decision?" he said to Elena. "Joint decision," she said. "My recommendation, his property." Aldrich looked at Silas. "The original vines in this section were producing under 400 pounds per acre," Silas said. "They were competing with the established sections and losing. Taking them out was—" He paused. "It was a hard call." "It was the right call," Aldrich said. "Just that." He set the notes back on the stake. Tempranillo in this soil at this elevation, if it takes the way these graph notes suggest it's taking, you're looking at a variety that will outperform Grenache here by year 5. Higher acid structure, better tannin development for aging. He looked at the row. Who told you to plant Tempranillo? I read, Elena said, and I looked at what the soil wanted. He regarded her for a moment with the attention of a man revising a category. Come show me the fermentation room, he said. The room was as she'd prepared it, clean, organized, the remaining bottles of the 1880 vintage on the shelf beside the equipment she'd laid out with a clear logic. Aldrich moved through it slowly, examining the barrels that had been used for aging, checking the condition of the stone walls and the natural temperature regulation of the space. He asked about the bottling process for the Haverford sale. She walked him through it. Then he picked up one of the remaining 1,880 bottles and looked at the label. You labeled these, he said. I did. He looked at her handwriting on the label. Mercer Estate, Harlan Creek, Arizona Territory. Harvest 1880. And something in his expression shifted by 1 degree, the professional neutrality thinning slightly. Open it, he said. Silas opened the bottle. There was a glass on the shelf. She'd put it there knowing this moment would come, and he poured a measure and handed it to Aldrich without pouring for himself or Elena. That restraint was exactly right. She hadn't told him to do that. He'd simply known. Aldrich tasted the way a professional tasted. Unhurried, full attention, the full evaluation before any conclusion. The fermentation room was quiet, except for the distant sound of the April wind through the vineyard outside. He set the glass down. This wine has problems, he said. It does, Elena said. The finish is rough. The aging wasn't managed properly. It wasn't. We know exactly why, and it won't happen with the next vintage. The base of it... He paused. He picked the glass back up and looked at the color in the light coming through the small high window. The base of this wine is from exceptional fruit. The fruit shows what this soil is capable of. He set the glass down again. This is a problem wine that proves a point. Silas had gone very still beside her. Aldrich looked at the room, at the barrels and the organized shelves and the bottles with their handwritten labels. Then he looked at Elena and then at Silas. I want to walk the rows one more time, he said. The Grenache sections. I want to look at the soil on the east face again. They walked back out into the April afternoon and went through the east rows a second time, slower, Aldrich stopping at intervals to push his hand into the earth the way she'd seen him do the first time. At the 5th row, he stopped for a long time, crouched, working the soil in his fingers. What's the water source? He said. Spring-fed channel that runs off the North Ridge, Silas said. Never failed, even in the dry years. Aldrich stood up. He was looking at the rows with the expression of a man who had arrived somewhere he hadn't fully expected to arrive. I'm going to be direct, he said, because I find it saves time. Please, Elena said. Voss and Partners came into the territorial market last year because California's supply is tightening, and our clients in the East want variety. We've been looking for regional operations with genuine potential. Not novelty, not territory curiosity, but actual winemaking capability from serious land. He looked at the row beside him. I've been through 11 properties in the territories in the past 8 months. Most of them were hoping I'd overlook what was wrong with them. A few of them were genuinely interesting. He looked at Silas. This property has something most of the interesting ones didn't. What's that? Silas asked. A plan that makes sense. He looked at Elena. And someone who can execute it. The silence that followed had a quality she hadn't felt before in all the months of work. Not the silence of two people avoiding something, or the silence of the desert night pressing down, but the silence of something having been said that couldn't be unsaid. Our standard regional contract covers 3 years, guaranteed purchase of the full harvest at a base price with quality premiums above threshold, Aldrich said, in the tone of a man who had shifted from evaluation to terms. We'd also want first right of purchase on anything that comes from the Tempranillo sections when they reach production. Silas looked at her. She looked at Aldrich. What's the base price? He named a figure. It was not the highest number she'd hoped for. In the optimistic version of this moment, she'd occasionally allowed herself in the pre-dawn hours. But it was real. It was a contract and a guaranteed buyer and a base price that, against the healthy sections at their projected yield, covered the banknote in August with enough left over to fund the next season without the knife-edge terror of the winter just past. It was enough to make the thing continue. "We'd want to review the contract language before signing," she said, because that was the correct response to any contract regardless of how good the number was. Aldrich almost smiled. Naturally. He buttoned his coat. "I'll have something drawn up by the end of the week." He looked around the property once more. The repaired fence, the growing rose, the house with its struggling roses that she'd been slowly bringing back on the weekends. "You've done something here," he said. It wasn't quite a compliment. It was more like an acknowledgement of a fact. "It's not finished, but what's been done is right." He drove back down the track toward town in his hired buggy, and she and Silas stood at the gate watching him go the same way they'd watched Pratt leave in March. Standing side by side in the afternoon light, the vineyard stretching out behind them. Silas's hand found hers. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't even particularly a decision. More like something that happened at the point where two things that had been moving toward each other finally arrived. His hand around hers, rough from months of the same work, the same cold mornings, the same soil. She didn't pull away. They stood like that for a while, not speaking, watching the track where the buggy had gone until it was out of sight, and there was only the road and the desert and the mountains going purple in the late afternoon. "It's not over," she said. "The harvest still has to come in." "I know," he said, "and the contract has to be reviewed. And the August banknote, Elena." His hand tightened slightly around hers. "I know." She was quiet. "Are you going to keep listing things that could go wrong?" he said. "Probably," she admitted. "All right." He didn't let go of her hand. "Keep listing them." She looked at the vineyard, the rows of established Grenache with their new growth heavy in the April warmth, the replanted sections with their patient stakes, the fermentation room where 12 bottles of imperfect real wine sat on a clean shelf. All of it under a sky that was going the particular colors of a desert April evening, colors that didn't exist anywhere else she'd been, saturated and strange and entirely themselves. "The harvest has to come in clean," she said. "The Grenache sections need a dry August. If we get late-season rain, then we deal with late-season rain," he said. She looked at him. He was watching the vineyard, the same vineyard he'd walked through for 4 years apologizing to it, and his face in the evening light had the look of a man who had stopped apologizing. She didn't say anything else. The wind moved through the rows and the vines moved with it, the new growth easy and alive. And somewhere on the south ridge a bird was calling in the dusk. Not a sound she'd learned to name yet, one of the desert birds she hadn't catalogued, but a real sound in a real place that was beginning, without her quite deciding it, to feel like home. The contract arrived on a Friday, 4 days after Aldrich drove back down the track toward town. Silas read it at the kitchen table with the careful attention of a man who had learned the hard way not to sign things he hadn't fully understood. Elena read it after him, and then they read the sections that mattered a second time together, passing pages between them across the table. It was what Aldrich had described. 3 years, guaranteed purchase, base price with quality premiums above a threshold that was aggressive but achievable given what she'd seen in the established sections. The first right of purchase clause on the Tempranillo harvest was standard language, reasonable in its terms. There was a quality inspection provision that required a Voss and Partners representative to assess the harvest before final pricing was set, which was normal practice and which she noted without alarm. "The inspection clause," Silas said, pointing to it. "If they assess low, then we argue it," she said, "with the soil data and the vine health records I've been keeping since October. A number isn't just a number when you can show the methodology behind it." She turned a page. "But I don't think we'll need to argue it. The Grenache sections are going to be what they're going to be, and what they're going to be is strong." He looked at her across the table. "You're sure?" "I'm sure enough to sign the contract," she said, which is the operational definition of sure. He signed it that afternoon. She witnessed it, her name in the margin below his in her straight handwriting. He folded it into an envelope and gave it to Hector to take to town with the Friday post, and then he stood in the kitchen doorway and watched the wagon go down the track and said nothing for a moment. "That's done," he said. "That's done," she agreed. May moved into the vineyard the way the best months did, not with a dramatic announcement, but with accumulation. Each day a little warmer than the last, the established sections pushing out the dense green growth that preceded a serious harvest. Elena walked the rows every morning before breakfast, the way she'd been doing since October, except that now the thing she was reading in the vines was not damage or distress, but readiness. The language of it was different, not the brittle communication of suffering, but something more like confidence, the particular stance of a plant that has found its footing and is doing the thing it was built to do. The Grenache was the best she'd seen it. She took precise measurements in the first week of May, berry size, cluster formation, the density of the canopy. And when she ran the numbers against the projections she'd made in March, the harvest estimate came in above what she'd told Aldrich to expect, not extravagantly above. A vineyard that produced extravagantly above projection would have made her suspicious of her own methodology, but solidly above, in the range that quality premiums applied. She told Silas over breakfast on a Thursday, setting the notebook in front of him with the numbers visible. He looked at them, then at her. "This is real?" he said. "It's a projection," she said, "but it's built on 7 months of consistent data, not optimism." He looked at the numbers for a long time. "The banknote," he said. "Covered. With the Haverford payments and the Voss base price, even at the low end of the harvest estimate, covered." He pushed the notebook back toward her and stood up and went to the window and stood there for a while. And she let him, because some moments don't need anything added to them. The Voss inspection happened in the first week of June, the morning after the first harvest samples came in. The inspector was a different man from Aldrich, younger, technically precise, with a portable kit for field analysis that he carried with the professionalism of a doctor making a house call. He spent 2 hours in the rows, taking berry samples, measuring Brix levels, examining cluster health. Elena walked with him and answered his technical questions with the directness she'd used with Aldrich, showing him the records when he asked for them. At the end of it, he sat at the kitchen table with his numbers and his kit and said, "The Grenache is going to come in at a premium grade." She felt the words land in her chest in a way that she hadn't let herself fully prepare for, because preparing for good things had always seemed like a way of inviting disappointment. "What's the premium threshold?" Silas asked. The inspector named the Brix and acid structure numbers that qualified. Then he named what she'd measured that morning. They cleared the threshold by a margin that put them solidly into the premium pricing band. The kitchen was very quiet for a moment. "I'll file the assessment with Mr. Aldrich," the inspector said, with the neutral tone of a man who did this regularly and understood what it meant without making it theatrical. He packed his kit, shook hands with both of them, and drove back toward town. Silas sat down at the table after he left. Just sat. Elena stood by the stove and looked at him. At the back of his neck, the set of his shoulders, the way he had both hands flat on the table in front of him. "Silas." He turned around. His face was not what she expected. She'd thought relief. What she saw was something more complicated than that, something that sat at the intersection of relief and grief, and 4 years of carrying something very heavy and suddenly feeling it set down. "She was right," he said. His voice came out rough at the edges. "About the land. She always said this place was something. She was right." Elena didn't say anything to that. She sat down across from him and put her hand on the table, not on his hand, just near it, available, and let him be in whatever that moment was for as long as it needed to be. After a while, he put his hand over hers. They stayed like that for a while in the kitchen, where they'd had 10 months of breakfasts and arguments about the ledger, and long evenings with soil records between them. And outside, the May afternoon was doing what it did. The light going long and gold across the rows, the established Grenache, heavy with fruit that would come in at premium grade, the replanted Tempranillo patient in its 3rd month of the years it would take to be ready. The harvest began on a Monday in late August. It was the hardest 10 days of physical work Elena had done since she'd arrived, and she'd done hard physical work since the first morning. Harvest was different. The density of it, the way every hour felt essential because the window for picking at peak condition was narrow and the desert didn't negotiate. Hector brought in 2 additional hands from town, men he'd worked with before who knew vineyard work, and even with that, the days started before dawn and ended after dark. She was in the rows every hour of it, directing the picking, checking the incoming fruit, making decisions at the fermentation room about sorting and timing with a speed that surprised even herself. She'd absorbed more than she'd realized in the months of reading and watching and doing. and the knowledge had become instinctive in the way that happens when learning and practice overlap long enough. Silas was everywhere at once, managing the pickers, maintaining the equipment, handling the hundreds of small crises that a harvest generated. She watched him work during those 10 days with a different kind of attention than she'd watched him with in October, when she'd been evaluating what kind of man she was dealing with. She knew what kind of man she was dealing with now. What she was watching was something she didn't have a word for exactly. A man in full possession of himself, moving through his own property with a certainty that had been absent when she'd arrived and that had come back in pieces through the months. So gradually she'd almost missed it happening. On the 6th day of harvest, Martha Gillam drove out from town. This was unexpected. Martha was not a person who made social calls, as far as Elena had been able to determine in 10 months. She appeared at the property in her wagon mid-morning, climbed down, looked at the organized chaos of harvest in progress, and found Elena at the fermentation room door sorting the morning's incoming fruit. "I won't keep you," Martha said. "I just wanted to see it." "See what?" Elena said, still sorting. "This." Martha looked around, at the pickers moving through the rows, at Hector managing the loading, at Silas across the yard directing the transport of full crates with the focused efficiency of a man whose property was producing. She looked at the vines. "I've been in this valley 23 years, she said. "I watched this place go up. I watched it go down." She was quiet for a moment. "I owe you something." Elena paused her sorting. "What do you owe me?" "When you got off that stage last October, I told Cecil Pratt you were going to last 2 weeks. She said it without apology, but with the directness of a woman who settled her accounts. That was wrong of me. Elena looked at her. Martha Gillam's face had made a decision about the world a long time ago and hadn't revisited it. She'd thought that the first day. She understood now that the decision wasn't hardness, exactly. It was protection. A woman who'd run a business alone in a frontier town for 23 years had learned to assess quickly and guard against disappointment. "You were working with the available evidence," Elena said. "The available evidence didn't include you," Martha said. She looked at the rows one more time with the measuring attention she'd used the first day at the stage stop. "I brought something." She went back to her wagon and produced a crate with 6 bottles in it. "From the Haverford, Fells sends his regards. He sold the last of the 1880 case 2 weeks ago and has been fielding questions about when the next vintage will be available." Elena took the crate. Inside the bottles was a note from Howard Fells in a neat commercial hand. 3 requests from regular dining room guests for Mercer Estate by name. Please advise availability of 1884 vintage. She read it twice. By name. Not Arizona wine or Territory Grenache. By name. Mercer Estate. She looked up, and Martha was watching her with an expression she'd never seen on the woman's face before. Something adjacent to satisfaction. The specific satisfaction of someone who had revised their assessment and found the revision correct. "Thank you," Elena said. "Don't thank me. Sell us the wine." Martha climbed back into her wagon. "You and Silas coming to the Harvest Social next month?" It was the first time anyone in town had said "you and Silas" as a single unit without making it a question or a topic. "Probably," Elena said. Martha nodded and drove back down the track, and Elena stood with Fells's note in one hand and the crate in the other, and the harvest moved around her in the August heat, and somewhere in the rows she could hear Silas's voice directing one of the pickers, and the ordinary sound of it, the particular voice she'd been hearing every morning for 10 months, settled in her chest with the weight of something that had stopped being temporary. She went back to work. The note from the Tucson bank came in the 2nd week of September. Silas opened it at the kitchen table after supper, read it, and handed it to her without comment. The August payment had been received. The note was current. The next installment was due in February, and at the new payment amount, reduced because the principal had dropped, the February figure was manageable without the knife-edge terror of a year ago. At the bottom, in a handwritten addition below the typed letter, "Congratulations on a strong season. We look forward to a continued relationship. J. Whitfield." Silas took the letter back and folded it and put it in the kitchen drawer where he kept the important documents, and she noticed that he put it near the front of the drawer, not buried at the back the way the previous bank correspondence had been. "What happens now?" he said. He was leaning against the counter, arms crossed, looking at her across the kitchen. She raised an eyebrow. What do you mean? What happens now? The fermentation room needs to be checked every other day through October while the new vintage is aging. The Tempranillo cuttings need their fall assessment. We need to winterize the irrigation before the first frost, and I want to look at expanding the north face planting before… Elena. She stopped. I didn't mean the vineyard, he said. He was looking at her with the look that had been developing since April, the open one, the one that didn't keep the weather off. She set down the dish she'd been drying and looked at him properly. 10 months since the stage from Tucson had rattled her into Harlan Creek with $11 and a name on a piece of paper. 10 months of rows and frost and ledgers and hard conversations, and a man who'd walked through his own land apologizing to it and had learned somewhere in the process to stop. She'd come here for the work, she'd told herself. She'd come because there was something to fight for, and she was tired of arriving at places and leaving them unchanged. She hadn't accounted for this part. That wasn't entirely true. She'd seen it coming the way you see weather coming on the desert horizon, a long time before it arrives, plenty of time to get inside or to decide to stand in it. She'd made her decision about that somewhere in the winter months, in the 4 a.m. hours when the land was dark outside the window. She just hadn't said it. I'm not leaving, she said. I know, he said. That's not what I'm asking. She looked at him, at the man who'd had his wife's Vineyard notes on the table the night before the buyer came, who'd gotten up at 1 a.m. in January without waking her, who'd handed Aldrich the wine glass with the right kind of restraint, who'd burned the old vines without making it theater, who'd said thank you for everything that's already happened the night before the most important day this property had seen in 4 years. What are you asking? She said. I'm asking if you want to stay because of the vineyard or because of this. He didn't gesture. He just held her gaze and let the word this carry what it meant. She thought about the honest answer. The honest answer was that the line between those two things had gotten difficult to locate, somewhere around January, around the time she'd found herself lying awake at 4 a.m, running numbers about a piece of land that wasn't hers and feeling something that wasn't professional investment. Both, she said. Is that a problem? Something in him settled. No, he said. That's an answer. He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and she didn't move back, and that was the rest of the answer. They were married in November, in the small ceremony that a frontier town did naturally, practical and without much ceremony, the judge from Harlan Creek doing the legal part in the parlor of the house on a Saturday afternoon with Martha Gillum and Hector and his wife as witnesses. Hector's wife, whose name was Rosaria and who had been bringing Elena dried chili remedies for her hands since the previous winter, cried a little during the vows and didn't apologize for it. Martha gave them a bottle of the 1880 vintage that she'd apparently bought from Fells without telling anyone, and Hector gave them a grafting knife with a handle he'd carved himself from mesquite wood. The simplicity of those gifts was exactly right. That evening, after everyone had gone, they sat on the front porch in the November cold with the Haverford bottle open between them, looking out at the vineyard in the last of the autumn light. The established sections were stripped and dormant now, the canes bare against the trellis wire, resting through the winter. The Tempranillo sections had that look of patient things, not dormant the way the older vines went dormant, but quiet in the particular way of something that had years of becoming still ahead of it. 3 more years before the Tempranillo comes in, she said. Approximately, he said. I want to add the north face expansion in spring. If we can get the financing… Elena. He handed her a glass. We should talk about it before spring gets here. It's November. We have time. He clinked his glass against hers. One thing at a time. She drank. The wine was what it had always been. The imperfect, real thing. The 1880 vintage that had aged in a locked room for 3 years without anyone watching it. The wine that had proved the point and opened the door. It tasted, as he'd said the first time, like 3 years ago. Like the year the vineyard had kept producing even when the man watching it had stopped being able to watch. She thought about what it meant, all of it. The months of work, the risk that had been real, and the outcome that was also real, and the way neither one had been guaranteed at any point. She'd believed in the soil because the soil had shown her something worth believing in. That was all. You looked at what was actually in front of you, and you made a decision about what it was capable of, and then you did the work that the decision required. Most people, she'd learned, looked at a thing and saw what it currently was, the condition it was in, The numbers it was producing, the story it was already telling. Seeing what something could become required a different kind of attention. Slower, more patient, more willing to be wrong in the direction of hope rather than despair. She wasn't sure if that was wisdom or stubbornness. Probably it was both. The best qualities usually were. The vineyard was quiet in the November dusk. The bare rows running in their long lines toward the ridge, the replanted sections patient in their stakes, the fermentation room behind them holding a vintage that would go to Boston and New York by spring and carry the name of this place to tables where no one had heard of Harlan Creek. None of it had been clean. The frost had taken what it took. The debt had pressed down until it was managed. The grief had been in the room for most of it, and was still in the room sometimes. She could feel it in him on certain mornings, in the way he sometimes stood at the edge of the Grenache section and was quiet for a moment before beginning work. Grief didn't resolve the way debts did. It became something you carried differently over time. What she'd helped him find, she thought, wasn't a way out of it. It was just a reason to keep carrying it in the direction of something. That was available to most people, in most situations. That was the thing she'd learned in the rows of a dying vineyard on an October afternoon when she should probably have gotten back on the stage and found something simpler. That the difference between a thing that was dead and a thing that had been failed was a question worth asking. That the answer changed what you did next. She leaned slightly against his shoulder. He didn't make anything of it, just shifted to accommodate it the way people do when the gesture is already familiar. The stars were coming up over the east ridge, thick and indifferent and permanent. The same stars she'd seen from the stage window on the road from Tucson 14 months ago, when she'd been moving toward an unknown with $11 and a folded advertisement. The desert looked the same from a distance, up close, in the soil, in the root systems that went down 4 feet through rocky ground to find water, in the canes that had kept growing in a locked room without anyone watching. It was different entirely. She looked at the rows until the light had fully gone, and she couldn't see them anymore, only sensed them in the dark the way you sense familiar things. "Come inside," Silas said. "It's cold." "A minute," she said. He stayed. He knew by now when a minute meant a minute and when it meant something else. This was somewhere between the two. She was finishing a thought, the way you sometimes need the end of a day to close before you can let it become the past. 14 months, a dying vineyard, now producing. A man who had been failing slowly towards something irreversible, now not. A woman who had arrived with almost nothing and built, not the thing she'd intended, which had been simple and safe, something that was going to outlast her intentions. The ledger was current, the contract was signed, the roots were deep enough to hold through whatever the next winter brought. That was enough to stand on. She picked up her glass and went inside, and behind her the vineyard settled into the November dark, and kept its patient work of becoming what it had always had the capacity to be. Waiting, the way all living things wait, for the right conditions, the right hands, the right season to show itself fully. It had found them. That was the whole story, and it was enough.